Hey everybody, this is Mike with the One Stop Co-op Shop, and today I'm reviewing Harakiri, a big adventure campaign dungeon crawler game set in a fantasy version of ancient Japan. And disclaimer that I was provided a review copy for this one. And this game is so big and has so many different things going on, I'm not going to do my usual 5 and 5. I'm just going to kind of talk through some of the key things about the game and give some thoughts overall, because I think I would do a bit of a disservice to this one if I tried to condense it down to just 5 points. So in Harakiri, you control 4 heroes. And the game is split into 2 phases. In the adventure phase, you travel around this map of ancient Japan, completing objectives and missions, having little traveling encounters, and reading a bunch of stuff from the big campaign book. And then, win or lose, you progress into an exploration phase, which is more of a typical dungeon crawler, but with some exploration elements. Move around, fight enemies, and again, read the campaign book and try to resolve whatever your objectives are. And in typical adventure dungeon crawler campaign fashion, you'll have different characters, they'll be leveling up in different ways, getting new inventory, unlocking new skills, you get the idea. So let's discuss some key things about Harakiri. So let's start by focusing on the adventure phase, and I do have a playthrough on the channel if you want to see this in action. So you'll have 1 or more missions in play for a given chapter at a time. When you reach certain locations or fulfill certain conditions, different things will happen. It'll often send you to the campaign book to go and read about things. And this is pretty cool. There's a lot of variety in the adventures. You're often trying to defend things from enemies who are moving around on the map. You're often trying to unlock certain locations or complete certain things or deal with certain bosses. But of course, it's all in an abstracted way. You don't have any detailed combat mechanics or anything. The missions are fairly linear, but at the same time, you'll often have little personal missions for your characters, and a lot of the time it's tough to make time for everything. So while I don't think there will be a ton of replay redoing the same chapters over and over, usually you can't see quite everything or accomplish everything successfully. And a fun element that kind of gives this a bit of an Arkham Horror, Eldritch Horror feel is that each time your characters move under most conditions, you're going to draw one of these little travel cards, and you'll draw a red or green one, usually red if you take a shortcut in your movement and try to get around faster. And these have little encounters, often kind of a choose your own adventure thing where you're not supposed to see what the bottom option is. Now, they are pretty random. Sometimes they can be horribly crushing and steal all your actions for the turn. Sometimes they don't do much of anything, but it does give you some interesting flavor and fun in the play, and also make the traversal puzzle of how to get around the map interesting. On the possibly positive or negative side of that traversal, you have generally 3 actions around. And 1 action lets you move up to 3 spaces. Some statistics and things can give you bonuses there. And then you can spend extra actions to move more. And then you can also use actions to interact with locations or attack enemies or resolve missions or resolve quests. But this can feel like a very tight puzzle, which you might enjoy or might not, because you usually have very limited time to do things. And if you move in the wrong way or get out of position, it can really slow you down and have you not accomplish much for a while. The side actions apart from moving are usually pretty basic and straightforward, which is good for gameplay speed, but maybe not as interesting, especially if you get somewhere you need to be, but you don't need to move for a little while. You might just waste all your turns getting some money or eating ramen. It's fine, but not necessarily super engaging. You also have skill tests, which are just a d6 roll with attribute bonuses, or a combat test will actually use some combat dice, but it kind of ends up being the same thing. And you're trying to reach certain thresholds, and those can be very impactful. You might be trying to kill an enemy, and if you don't kill them, they'll fail one of your quests because they, I don't know, destroyed a town you were trying to defend or something. So there is a fair bit of randomness in things, and sometimes it's tough to get the right character who's stronger in attributes to the right place, and you can have pretty bad negatives for it, so those who are luck-averse might not love that whole aspect of things. But to be fair, it does lead to some branching in the campaign, so I think that randomness can be a bonus if you kind of go along with the ride. And as you're going along, the Shogun's influence is counting up and down based on different actions you take. The round counts up, there are triggers on certain rounds. You also have these Shogun cards that you're drawing, and they have different effects based on how tough or easy the Shogun's influence level is. Now, I did find in my plays that a lot of times these didn't matter at all. They would affect things that didn't really have anything to do with where I was on the map or what actions I was taking. But when they do, they can be pretty thematic and impactful, so no real complaints here. So I think that's about it for the adventure phase. Generally, I think this is pretty cool, and it is definitely more involved than what you usually see in kind of the adventure half of these split adventure and dungeon crawler games. Now, focusing on the dungeon crawler phase of things, the exploration phase. This one I would most compare to Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition if you took out the app-enabled stuff, and if it was more focused on combat, because combat is a heavy thing here. So you'll be taking turns on tiles, and they often do have multiple tiles in play at a time. you're moving around, you're rolling attacks, the basic kind of dungeon crawler stuff. But kind of like in the adventure phase, the game has a lot of focus on exploration and narrative. So you'll have often little points you can interact with, NPCs you're trying to protect. Again, there's a lot of variety in what you're doing in the missions, chase missions, protection missions, exploration, just tons of stuff. And those will again send you to the big campaign book where you're reading the story. We'll get to that in a second. But at a fun touch that I haven't seen exactly done this way before, each location that you have in play will have these little event cards. Sometimes it only has one, sometimes it has two, a green and a red, and you'll draw cards to randomize which one you're going to pull up. And they slowly get revealed and give you different events, and sometimes you'll read in the book, sometimes it'll just be like a bonus or a penalty for some of the enemies, or they'll attack again. But this gives a lot more of that feeling of exploration and narrative and excitement and tension. And this kind of happens as a timer, while these interaction points happen based on what the players do, but they might interrelate. So if I don't save this civilian in time, maybe by the time this card gets pulled out a certain amount, they'll get killed by a monster. So again, this kind of reminds me of something like Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition's app-enabled play, but without the app. And it actually plays pretty smoothly. It's pretty exciting. It's pretty cool. And it adds even more variety because you have different ones of these location cards for every single mission in the game. So even if I'm in the same, dojo again, then I'll have different cards for the next mission and different things will happen and the setup will be different and the enemies will be different. So all of this, the exploration, the narrative within a dungeon crawler, I would compare it positively to something like Agamonia from this year. I think there's a lot of cool stuff going on. Now, as for the actual tactical movement and combat, this is a bit more of a mixed bag for me, but there are still cool things here. So first of all, just to show you how initiative works, you have cards for each of your characters, you have cards for every enemy on the board, and you just shuffle them up each round and deal them out. And then there are some abilities that can move things around, swap where people are, get your characters ahead of enemies. It's fine. It's a little bit random. It does take a little while to resolve each round, but I've certainly seen way worse initiative systems. It doesn't really insult me in any way. On a player's actual turn, they'll usually have 3 actions, just like in the adventure phase. And again, they can move once per turn. They can attack once per turn. Attacking will use 1 or usually 2 actions to get a heavier attack that's more likely to go through enemy defenses. Now, while attacking does get a bit more interesting as you unlock character skills and abilities, we'll get to those a little bit later, it is definitely, at least in my experience playing the game so far, on the simpler side of tactical gameplay. There's almost never any terrain. You can't knock people into fires or throw them off cliffs or that kind of thing. Often the tiles are small enough and the enemies can almost always move and attack when they activate, so you can't really avoid them too easily. They can't really avoid your attacks too easily. So often the game kind of boils down to, for better or worse, moving to enemies to get within range, attacking them, and interacting with things as you go. So it's not bad. It's just pretty basic for dungeon crawler stuff. Again, I would compare it to something like Agamonia, which has very simplified combat. This is not your Gloomhaven. This is not Tales from the Red Dragon Inn with lots of interactable terrain features and such. This is just pretty straightforward dungeon crawler combat. Enemy activation is pretty cool, though. They will activate differently based on whether you drew a green or red card for the turn. I mentioned that when I talked about the events. They'll have different special attacks. They have their own stats and abilities, and it's pretty straightforward to resolve. It tells you what type of person they're targeting. They do the first thing that applies, and there's a bit of variation in it, not just the red-green, but also usually a die roll for most enemies. There are also bosses that have decks that activate them and things like that. But this is pretty straightforward, pretty easy to resolve. The enemy turns don't take very long. I appreciate that, but they still have some variety in how they play out. Now, when enemies attack you, when you attack enemies, you're rolling dice. You start out rolling 2 or 3 per attack, but late game you could be rolling 6 or 7. And they have a number of slashes on them, and it varies by die type, but all of them have miss sides and very low sides. So just go into this game knowing it is very swingy in combat. You can have a roll and do amazing, that was a really good roll there, or you could have another roll and apparently still do pretty good. Okay, well, I'm not really demonstrating it here, but sometimes you totally flop your roll. Sometimes you do a ton of damage in one go. At least early game, there isn't much mitigation. There aren't too many things that reroll. And they even give you this focus die that can give you a bigger bonus, but can also make your entire attack miss and even let the enemy counter attack. That's a choice if you want to use that, but it's another thing that's kind of adding to the variability in the dice rolling here. So yeah, kind of like with the adventure phase and the skill test, there's a lot of luck involved. Your characters can take tons of damage if the enemies roll really well against you. You can do almost 0 damage to them and waste your 1 attack for a round if you don't roll well against them, and the timer is always ticking, so that can definitely compound sometimes. Especially because enemies tend to have pretty high armor values, and it goes up as the game goes along. So there are many times where you just won't overcome their armor, and you could get frustrated with your attacking. So keep that in mind. This is definitely a random game with a lot of dice chucking. Could be good or bad depending on your taste. Now let's talk about characters and leveling a little bit. Zoom in on that. So you have 4 different characters. You always play with them. In the Act 1 campaign that I played, it's always the exact same 4 characters. And they have some things that are different about them, but not a ton. So let's talk about it. So first of all, leveling up, you can level up these attributes as you go. You level up every 2 or 3 chapters in the campaign, and you can get automatic damage from strength, extra movement from stealth. The spirituality meditation stat lets you do better things with these blue dice, which you use to activate your skills. We'll get to that in a second. And then this one mainly lets you access better items from the item deck. So it's kind of the least sexy and exciting one, but some characters should get that to at least open yourselves up to those items. So each character in the game starts with a different 1 attribute, but besides that, you can raise them however you like, and they're all pretty generic in their bonuses, so that's definitely not going to separate characters too much, but it does feel good to gain them. You're also getting more life as you level up, you're getting new equipment, and this becomes way, way more powerful. Like, look, from a level 1 bow dealing 2 dice of damage to a level 5 bow dealing crazy amounts of damage, and the abilities get stronger and that kind of thing. So I think this is pretty cool how you level up with items and things, although I will note that in my experience, about halfway through the campaign, they generally mostly feel like you're just getting higher numbers, like rolling more dice, getting higher armor. And the enemies are getting more life and getting higher armor as well. So it is one of those, and this is pretty typical of dungeon crawlers, so not a big complaint. It's one of those dungeon crawler games where new equipment just kind of scales with the enemies, and in the end, I didn't really feel like I was necessarily actually getting stronger. It just kind of all balanced together, but it's fine. It's cool to be rolling like 6 dice and hitting huge combos and things. Now, the biggest differentiator character to character are these skill tiles. You unlock them as you level up. Tomoe will always have the exact same level 1. Hattori the ninja will always have the exact same level 1, so there's only one like non-choice there. But as you get level 2 and 3 and 4, they're double-sided, so you have a little bit of choice of which to go with. And they can be ongoing bonuses. They can be bonuses to attacking. They will require you to have certain values of these blue dice, these key dice placed in them. And then managing that, especially with the spirit statistic, becomes a little bit of an extra like resource management thing. But yeah, these skills are cool. They do differentiate the characters the most out of anything. Some people are more support based. Some people are more melee combat and tank based. And you kind of change which way you go with the character as you flip them around. But I would say they're only mildly exciting for me, especially because you can only use 1 attack ability per attack. Now, you won't have the right values to like activate all of them at once anyway. But yeah, the fact that you can't like combo those attack bonuses together does limit the excitement of unlocking all your skills just a little bit. Now, one other thing that's pretty cool and unique is that each of your characters gets to associate themselves with a kami, kind of like a god or spirit of ancient Japan. And you'll also be leveling this up. It's a little bit inconsistent because you have to earn karma, which usually comes from the adventure phase. Then you have to go to like these temples and actually level up your connection to your kami. But then when you do, you get these really awesome like once per battle bonuses. And eventually you unlock this little bit like Aeon Trespass Kami mode, where you can like turn into your god, your like supporter for a little while and do crazy stuff, but then you like get defeated for the rest of the adventure. So I think that's pretty exciting and fun and does add a little bit more flavor. Now you can freely pick these at the beginning of the campaign, who gets which ones. You can kind of create sort of combos for your characters. So yeah, the leveling up overall in Harakiri is not best in class. It's not like blowing me away, but it does its job fine. It does differentiate the characters somewhat, without being too difficult to control 4 of them in solo. Like, these are very simple characters. I don't have a giant deck of cards I got to deal with for each of them. So it does the job. It's all right. All right, and lastly, let's touch on the story. It's okay. There is a lot of reading. Sometimes, let me show you. They get into like really long passages, especially at the start of chapters and stuff. So if you don't like reading flavor text and such, that might not excite you. And then during the adventures, during the exploration, you are constantly referring to numbers, like as you're exploring interaction tokens, as you're resolving missions. And this is in addition to like reading all the stuff for your travel and such. So if you like this kind of thing, if you like exploration and narrative in your dungeon crawler adventure games, I think you're going to have a lot of fun. The writing is fine. Sometimes the tone feels a little bit off. The translation is not always perfect. Every once in a while they have like an accidentally left in like Spanish word. Nothing too distracting. I certainly didn't mind it much. If you watch my playthrough videos, you can kind of see that usually it reads fine. There's a reasonable amount of branching in the stuff that I've read. Not a ton. I mean, like some cities can be overrun or raised over time, so like the adventure map can change somewhat. You'll be checking off little earned events, and that'll change how things play out for you somewhat. So yeah, it seems like it'll have not a ton of replay if you wanted to go through the adventure again, but you could play through it again. You'd just see mostly the same stuff. Now, it is super cool and reminds me a lot of, again, and Agamonia is these character books. You have a different booklet for each character, and they have their own personal quests. And this is really cool. First of all, you get like a ton of history about the character and the clan they come from. Again, lots of reading though. And then during the adventure phases, mainly, you'll have little side quests. And it usually has like 2 characters per adventure. So like, oh, this time, Hattori and Akira are the ones that are focused on. And next, it's Tomoe and Hikaru. And they'll have things that'll be like, hey, get distracted from the main mission and come try to find your father. Or come try to deal with these giant like yokai that are on running amok. Or figure out how to deal with this demon hunter. Or find your wife. Like, they're compelling. They give like a personal touch to things. Even though, again, you are reading a lot. I like the things, and I like that it's sort of a distraction / an alternate goal during the adventure phase. And again, you can't lose the adventure phase. You'll always go on to the next dungeon crawler phase. But, you might have a harder time or worse things to deal with. So yeah, I think this is pretty cool. Now, I will say, at least from what I've seen so far, you didn't really unlock anything from this. It really is almost entirely narrative focused. Like, at least as far as I got about halfway through the campaign, it's not like by doing some portion of Hattori's quest, I unlocked like a new sword or I got like a new armor piece. So, you're not coming into it for that more mechanical kind of aspect. But I certainly appreciate that these characters feel fleshed out, that they feel interesting, that there is more going on than just the basic narrative. Because the basic narrative is fine. Like, you're trying to stop this evil shogun. Each of the chapters kind of goes together, but it's sort of like, hey, what's the monster of the week? Okay, now we're going to a forest to fight this. Okay, now we're going to a mountain to fight that. So it's okay. So I do like this to kind of give more continuity and stakes. Because I don't know, if they're like, hey, save vague Japan from monsters. Okay, that's fine. But if it's like, hey, save your wife from slavery, I'm in. Like, that gets me involved immediately. I definitely care about that. So there you go. That is an overview of Harakiri in more than 5 minutes. Sorry that this was a different format for my reviews. Hope you found that helpful, and feel free to ask any questions. Or again, go watch my playthrough. I have one of the initial exploration and one of the initial adventure, so you can see a lot of the game in action. But overall, I'd recommend checking this one if you are into exploration, into a big sweeping narrative of an adventure game. If you don't want a very crunchy dungeon crawl experience that can take a lot of like strategy and thinking to play, if you want to just kind of jump in and roll some dice and kill things, I think all of that will float your boat. And especially I think the adventure phase is going to appeal to those who like the Arkham and Eldritch horror games of the world, because it does have a lot of cool things going on, a lot of variety in the scenarios, and you're making a lot of neat choices while also having, again, a lot of flavor from these travel events and objectives and everything. So that is Harakiri. Thanks for watching, everybody. Good gaming, and I'll see you at the next stop.